FutureSense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nyck Jeanes and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, FutureSense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is FutureSense. Yes, and good morning to you here on Bay FM 999. And you're now tuned to FutureSense. Myself, Nyck Jeanes, and Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick. That sounds appropriate for today's
It does indeed.
Show.
It does indeed. We have a special guest today on the show in about half an hour or so, and that is Lucy Haslam. Lucy is a retired nurse and has a big background in caring for people over a long period of time. But in August 2013, Lucy spearheaded the movement to reintroduce medicinal cannabis into Australia. Lucy witnessed the dramatic relief her son, Dan, suffering stage 4 bowel cancer at the time, gained from using medicinal cannabis, and Dan championed the cause alongside his mother, and together they started a social campaign which ultimately changes Australian laws, or has changed Australian laws, but there's a long way to go. And we're going to be talking to her because in a week after next, on the 22nd, 23rd and 24th of this month in March in Tweed Heads, there is a symposium on medicinal cannabis at Tweed Heads, produced or presented by United in Compassion, UIC, which is unitedincompassion.com.au, which is her website. So we'll be talking to her in about half an hour, which will be great, about the many issues around medicinal cannabis in Australia.
Absolutely, and it's a really good example of the process of trying to bring social change, which is so important at this time, because here we are in the early stages of a global paradigm shift, in fact multiple paradigm shifts happening simultaneously, and the capacity to open up to and initiate change within society is going to be key to how we navigate the next 2 decades or 3 decades.
Indeed. Yes. We're also going to be talking, because all of this comes down in a sense to how we take in, observe and take in and be open to, be curious about life, the universe and everything. And a little quote I came across this morning, I think from a physicist, a German physicist, Heinrich Röhr. And he says, science means constantly walking a tightrope between blind faith and curiosity, between expertise and creativity, between bias and openness, between experience and epiphany, between ambition and passion, and between arrogance and conviction. In short, between an old today and a new tomorrow. So we're going to be having a look and seeing through the frame of that today about our curiosity, your curiosity, how we close ourselves down, dumb ourselves down, if you will, in society. And of course, with a couple of elections coming up very shortly, New South Wales and federal elections, it's a good time to be not dumbed down by the discourses that are perpetrated, particularly, in my opinion, by the coalition at this time, but not only that, and how can we stay and remain open to new energies, new ideas, new science coming in.
Yeah, indeed. Some people might be familiar with the I Ching, which is a very ancient Chinese book of wisdom that talks about the process of change. And there's a website called the I Ching Weekly, which is put out by Bobby Klein, who he sends out a reading each week. And the reading for this week is a little couplet that goes like this: thunder shakes the roof, you go back to sleep. Big thunder comes again, this time you wake up.
Fantastic. Lovely. You're with FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes through till 11 o'clock this morning. Let's play a bit of Infected Mushroom, Israeli band, because you've been listening to a bit of Infected Mushroom the last day or so, Steve.
I have. I'm exploring a new, I'm not sure how new it is actually, but anyway, a streaming service called Deezer, DEEZER.com, and I subscribe to that, and they are interesting in that they offer a hi-fi version. So for if you're an audio nerd like I am, you can pay a bit extra and get high quality, high bitrate sound.
We're talking about like 4 times the bitrate of the top level of MP3, isn't it?
Yeah, even more. Well, I guess, so like 320 is what you would normally get like off a CD quality extraction, and it's I think it's 1411, 1411 or something that you can get through the hi-fi version, and if you've got a good sound system, decent speakers, etc., it's really worth it because you pick up a whole bunch of detail in the music that you don't normally get to hear. And they've got this is not an ad for Deezer. I'm not earning any money for this, but they've got a really huge sound library, and I've been exploring a whole bunch of music in there, including a bit of Infected Mushroom yesterday. Yeah.
And in fact, as you've been noticing, it seems that the algorithms with this particular service compared to some other services were particularly amazing and sophisticated somehow.
Yeah, so on the weekend I programmed a couple of hours of music, and then I just let it go on auto and play recommended tracks after that, and I got about 3 or 4 hours of really consistently good and appropriate music that I hadn't, most of which I hadn't heard before, so it was very interesting.
Fantastic. You're resonating right now on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes. Yeah, and that's going to be absolutely fantastic, and congratulations to our own Sister Mary, Saturday mornings, for organising this first of these house concerts around the area. They're going to be wonderful, and we're going to be broadcasting them for Bay FM. Good stuff. We're going to be talking very shortly, as I said, to Lucy Haslam, who is the organiser of the United in Compassion Symposium on Medical Cannabis, coming up on the 22nd, 23rd and 24th of March in Tweed Heads. We'll give you details about that if you haven't heard about it. We'll be talking to her very shortly, but just to set that up a little bit, Steve, we were talking a little bit about the change process itself, and in respect of last week's conversations.
Yeah, last week we looked at change, and particularly changing human values and how that can set up conflict and tension between different value sets. And I think the whole cannabis and drug prohibition issue is a very good example of how change can take place on a large scale, and also how change is resisted, by people whose values can't open or can't accept, the new ideas and those sorts of things. So it's going to be very interesting talking to Lucy and hearing about her experience and her impression of what have been the good things about what has been achieved around medical cannabis in Australia, and what are the obstacles that she's run into, and the kinds of behaviours that she's seen from different people, and their acceptance or openness to new things or lack of. It's going to be an interesting conversation, I think.
Absolutely. And as we've discovered, a country, for example, like Canada, which has had medicinal cannabis on the schedule for quite a significant amount of time. I think it's 2001, was that the date you found? Or 2011?
Yeah, I think you're right. So I was surprised at that.
Yeah.
I know they recently made it legal recreationally in Canada, and they're only the second country in the world, where the whole nation has accepted and legalised
after Uruguay.
Recreational cannabis use after Uruguay. Yeah. So that's very interesting, and obviously they're one of the most progressive countries in the world when it comes to this particular issue.
And 350,000 people in Canada have been approved for medicinal cannabis. 350,000 over some time. In Germany, which apparently legalised medicinal cannabis in the same way as Australia, about the same time, has 100,000 people who are legally able to obtain this medicine. And Australia, at this point, has about 3,500, 1/10 or less of a given population comparisons.
Yeah,
about 1/10 of the German thing. So there's something clearly wrong with the system.
Yeah, look, it's not unusual for Australia to be lagging behind the rest of the world. I mean, this is something that many people have been aware of for a long time. That sometimes it can take 15 or 20 years for Australia to accept something that's accepted overseas. And part of the reason may be our physical isolation from the rest of the world. I mean, Canada is right next door to the US, which is certain states in the USA have been leaders also in the acceptance of cannabis use. And I wonder whether that close proximity, physical proximity, has an impact on things. I'm sure it does, because change is essentially very closely tied to the communication process, and the faster that communication happens, the faster change happens. And there's a difference between reading about things in the paper, hearing about them, or seeing them on the internet, and actually meeting somebody who has experienced it personally. And I think that impact of personal contact would have certainly play a key role in helping people to accept change. It's one thing to say, I read about this on the web, but it's another thing to say, I met somebody who actually did this and they said it was fine, and it was actually good, contrary to what some people are saying. So I think that has a big part to play in the fact that Australia does lag behind often with these issues.
You also notice that a lot of Americans, even though there are more advanced laws in many states in America regarding these issues, particularly in places like Colorado that we know about, California, I think, but a lot of Americans are crossing the border into Canada to gain access to medicinal cannabis there.
That's right. I was reading up a little bit on cannabis timeline for legalisation this morning, and it mentions cannabis refugees in Canada. It says there are cases of users of medical cannabis in the US who, on being persecuted in their own country, have fled across the border to Canada and sought asylum under the United Nations Refugee Convention. Seriously, yeah.
Well, I guess Trump can either not build a wall, or maybe Canada will have to build a wall there in Canada and the US border. That'll be a big wall.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of jokes about that.
A wall of ideology of some sort or other.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is that Claire Grace, in his research, he wrote that during times of change, people often increase their drug use. And there are good reasons for that, because changing your perspective can help you find new ways of doing things. And so this is also important from that perspective. You know, cannabis being a psychoactive substance.
Yes.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM.
Yeah, you're tuned to FutureSense here with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes, and it's 9:33. We have on the line from Tamworth. Great pleasure to welcome Lucy Haslam to Bay FM this morning. Good morning, Lucy.
Good morning, Nyck.
Very nice of you to join us this morning. We've already mentioned that you, some of your history and your background in terms of organising the upcoming conference in Tweed Heads on medicinal cannabis on the 22nd, 23rd and 24th. But you've organised similar conferences since 2014, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I organised the first one that Australia had in 2014, and we've done two other events since then in Sydney and Melbourne. So first time in the northern part of the state, and hopefully reaching out to people in Queensland as well.
Yes, indeed. Now, you, of course, have a very personal story, how you came on to being a strong advocate, more than a strong advocate, really the leading advocate in Australia for medicinal cannabis. Can you give us a little bit of a brief background about your own story and your son, Dan?
My youngest son, Dan, was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer in 2010. He was just 20 years old at that stage. And he had 5 years of very grueling treatment. By 4 years in, he was getting very, very sick, having continuous chemotherapy. And he literally had to be hospitalised every time he had chemotherapy because of the chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting that he suffered. He was losing a lot of weight. He had no appetite. He was very anxious, very depressed. And, you know, we tried him with medical cannabis as an absolute last resort. I was very averse to cannabis use. My husband had been in the drug squad for many years. I was a nurse and had been taught it was a dangerous gateway drug. But, you know, we were so desperate by that point, we would have tried anything. And when we tried it with Dan, it was like an absolute miracle. It literally stopped him vomiting and gave him an appetite immediately. And, you know, I just can't stress that enough. It was just really the godsend that we were looking for at that time.
Mm. And you started with him, you co-founded UIC, United in Compassion, to look at working on amending the Narcotic Drugs Act. And he did that actually on the 3rd anniversary of that act in 1967 being passed, and the 4th anniversary of the passing of Dan on 24th of February, just a couple of weeks ago, 4 years ago. So the current situation is pretty dire. We mentioned before we started with you looking at some figures. For example, you'd be able to flesh them out with a country like Germany, which apparently legalised in the same kind of way medicinal cannabis at about the same time as Australia. But in Germany, with say twice the population of Australia, there's about 100,000 approved script or access to medicinal cannabis, compared to only 3,100 or so in Australia. So that's obviously something funny about that.
And those numbers aren't actual patients. They're just approvals. So, you know, they could be repeats. They could be people that actually, and this I imagine would be a certain percentage of it, people that get approval, then find the cost of the product that they're approved for and realise that they can't can't possibly afford it, so they don't follow through. So there's not a lot of transparency in those figures, and I find it very hard to believe that the Australian government is patting themselves on the back over such ridiculous figures when we know that, there are possibly hundreds of thousands of Australians that are using the product from the illicit market for medical purposes, who aren't having their needs met or addressed in any way, shape or form.
Indeed.
And Lucy, those 3,000 and some Australians who've got approval to use medical cannabis at the moment, how many of those do you think would be having supply issues?
Oh, look, I think a great number of them are having supply issues. But the biggest one, of course, as I just mentioned, is the cost. The sheer cost is just ridiculous. Something really has got to be addressed. And you'll probably notice that the politicians are all staying incredibly silent on this, even though we have state and federal elections coming up. There's not a peep out of them on medical cannabis. And, we're looking for a hero at this point, someone who's actually going to do something meaningful and realistic for patients who are already suffering from whatever their conditions are. And we're talking about some really sick people here, people with terminal illness, end of life sort of stuff. We're talking about children with intractable epilepsy. These are people whose lives depend on medical cannabis. And I just can't believe the lack of humanity around this.
Well, our show, Lucy, as you probably know, is called FutureSense, and we're focused on global change and the dynamics of change, and particularly the role of human values and changing human values in that process. And I think this is a really interesting issue to look at in terms of people whose values might stop them from being open to even looking at the possibility of changing to a medicine or accepting a medicine like medical cannabis. And I'd be interested in your opinion as to what you think the major obstacles have been at a human level when you talk to politicians and other people who have the potential to make change in society. What do you see the key things, the key aspects of their behaviour and personality which seem to be creating speed bumps or roadblocks?
Oh, look, I think, the war on drugs definitely plays a huge role. And I mean, cannabis was vilified for over 100 years. So the only research into cannabis has been on the harms of cannabis. It's been very difficult to study cannabis for any other purpose other than that. Like myself, I considered cannabis was a dangerous gateway drug because that's what I'd been taught. So I had my own personal biases that I had to get over. And the only way to get over those is through education. And that's why, we have this education vacuum. And that's why I fight so hard to put on things like these symposiums with little funding, really is because I need to change opinions. And you can only do that through educating about the science. But at the moment, we have this denial of the science, which is quite quite deeply entrenched in our bureaucrats. And our politicians, they just, and even in our medical profession, sadly, that they don't know what they don't know. But not only that, they don't want to know what they don't know. And, I just think that patients should always be at the fore of this. We should be thinking about what is the best for the patient. And surely it is not sticking your head in the sand and denying that this is going on. It's actually recognising and reacting and being compassionate around the need. I don't know why. It's all about, at a political level, it's all just about getting re-elected, but somebody hasn't actually switched the light on and realised that this is politically very popular. The Australian people, by and large, are right behind this. And there's so many other benefits for Australia. I just I don't understand really what the holdback is apart from ignorance.
Yeah, we've run into very, very similar issues with the organisation that I'm co-founder of, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, in our campaign to try and have some formal research initiated here in Australia around psychedelic and psychoactive medicines. And we have had some recent success, as I was mentioning to you off air, with the psilocybin study that's going to be going ahead very shortly in Melbourne with St Vincent's Hospital, which is a great breakthrough. But from a human values perspective, this is something that I've studied for many, many years, and we talk about regularly on the show. There are a couple of different value sets at play here, so it's not just it's not sort of one blanket reason that the resistance is occurring. One of the issues is that people who have absolutistic values often latch onto a truth, and in some cases a classic example can be like a religion, where there's a set of rules that you must follow in order to live a good life, and anything that sits outside that rule set they can't even consider. So it's not about rationalizing, it's not about explaining the science, it's just that it doesn't fit with their rule set for life. And so that can be, very, very resistant to change, that attitude. But another one stems from the more contemporary, modern, scientific, industrial era values, which are about personal agendas and personal success. And often when people are pursuing their own success, it's a little bit like playing a poker game where you keep your cards held close to your chest and you don't necessarily reveal what cards you have or even what your real intentions are. And we see that in politics, where politicians are unduly influenced by corporations, for example, and then they pursue an agenda which is not explicit. And often they'll show up looking very strange and ignorant in public because they've got an underlying agenda that's not being expressed, that they won't talk about. And something I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on is the possibility, I think it's a certainty, to be honest with you, but how much do you think lobbying is influencing this resistance, for example, from industry like Big Pharma and also the drinks lobby, which have a very serious interest in resisting other recreational drugs coming onto the market?
Yeah, look, I don't doubt that for a minute. I mean, obviously I can't prove it, but if you look at you go back to 2014 when Mike Baird sort of met Dan and very quickly wanted to change things in New South Wales, and I believe he was very genuine in that. It was like this sort of roller coaster took off, and we had lots of media attention, and there was a lot of public opinion and conversation happening, and it became clear that the Australian public were behind this, and therefore it looked like the political wave was moving forward very quickly. But then all of a sudden we went through this transition where things started to slow down, and there was no obvious reason for it. But, I can only imagine now it was what was going on in the background. It was the backroom conversations that were probably being held by these lobbyists with the politicians that, who, like you say, had a vested interest for slowing this down. In New South Wales, I'm going to stick my head on the chopping block here and say that there was a very deliberate attempt from within the government by certain senior ministers to go against the Premier's wishes and to slow this down. And I've heard of this firsthand now from somebody who was there, who felt it was important that I understood why things very quickly came to an abrupt halt. And at that time, I used to be saying to the Premier, what's going on, Mike? Why isn't this happening, And he would be reassuring me that they're working hard behind the scenes, but unbeknownst to him and myself, yes, they were working very hard behind the scenes, but they were working out on how they could stop it, how they could slow it down. And it came down to things as sinister as, insisting on evidence through RCTs, wrapping it up in clinical trial evidence. And, we all know that clinical trials take a lot of money, they take a lot of time. And if you make those trials unpalatable to patients, that takes a long time to recruit. And as it has played out, that's exactly what was happening. And I can see that, unbeknownst to me at the time, that was very definitely actions that were put in motion by senior bureaucrats and senior ministers in New South Wales government. Yeah. And with that knowledge now, I just, it's a bitter pill. It's a really bitter pill to swallow. And I think it's time that the Australian public and New South Wales public, ahead of the election, know what's been going on. We've had to fight hammer and nail for patients in New South Wales to be approved. And we did that by bringing to public attention some of the situations that were going on with people being denied access. And things are a little bit better in New South Wales now, but mainly because we highlighted the injustices that were being done, the cruel injustices that were being done on a personal level
Indeed.
So
We're talking to Lucy Haslam, who is a prime advocate for medicinal cannabis in Australia, arguably, and a personal history. Most of you probably have heard of Lucy and heard her interviewed before, I expect. But it's a very important time, as you said, Lucy, with the elections coming up. I'm wondering, you mentioned there about some of the methods of the recourse that people have to go to when they cannot get this approval through the many hoops that you're describing here, and the obvious political roadblocks that are occurring. When we talk about the black market, that many people, perhaps up to 50, 100,000 people in Australia, maybe a very large number, are accessing black market to receive their medicinal cannabis. Can you give us a bit of a sketch about what the problems with that is, for a start?
Well, look, for me personally, I've always felt that sick people don't necessarily. It's not really a good spot for them to be having to grow their own medicine. I'm not averse to people growing their own medicine, but I just think if you're really ill, and I've got to admit, we tried it, and we didn't do it very successfully. So that's one of the things. You don't know what strain you're growing. You don't know what cannabinoid profile you're growing in your vegetable patch. You don't know if your soils are contaminated with heavy metals or pesticides. You can, if you live on the coast, chances are you're growing something that might be contaminated with mold or mildew. These are not great options for people that are really sick. But having said that, most people at the moment, that's the only option. So I'm not saying I'm against it. Yeah. I'm just saying that we shouldn't be in a position where people are having to rely on that. And I guess the biggest factor, of course, is that in doing so, you're putting yourself into the realm of criminality. Yes. And if you've already got the burden of disease or pain or illness, you don't want to add criminality to the mix, because let me tell you, I get contacted by a lot of patients who've had that knock on the door from the police, and it just puts their lives into a completely different space. They're already stressed enough. This is adding massively to the mental health issues of many really sick people. And, while it's all lovely to say that police can exercise discretion, let me tell you that discretion is not being exercised by a lot of police, and that's really unfortunate.
On that topic, there's a current issue with a veteran in Townsville, Lee Donnellan. Can you just give us a bit of a sketch about what's happened for Lee up there?
Look, he's had a really rocky road. He's a war veteran with service in Afghanistan. Yes. He has PTSD, and he began medicating himself quite well using cannabis. He was able to get off a lot of the opiates that he had become addicted to through his war service. He basically wanted to go down the legal route. He tried very hard, 4 to 18 months, to get approval through the regulated system. He got given that approval as, I think, the first veteran in Australia, saw the price of the product, and then obviously couldn't afford it as a pensioner.
It's like $1,800 a month or something, is it? $1,800 a month or thereabouts?
Look, I'm not exactly sure.
I think I read that.
That wouldn't surprise me. He's fought very hard to get his, he's a gold card holder. CVA pays for all his other medications, yet they're, not wanting to approve the payment of his cannabis because it's an unregulated product. So he's been, trying to do that for a long time. Before Christmas, he couldn't get his supply because of, supply issues with the importer. Then I think the floods played a part in him not being able to access it through the local pharmacy. So in desperation, he started growing it himself. And this is a man who needs to keep himself stable. And this has been proven to be the best source of treatment for him. Yes. So unfortunately, he was, got the knock on the door from the police on Friday, growing a small amount of medicine for himself. And here we go again. This man has already got PTSD. He's a war hero, and we're treating him as a criminal.
Yes, indeed.
I think we can do a lot better than that in this country. And over the weekend, I contacted Dr. Sue Sisley from America, who's doing this massive study on PTSD with war veterans over there. And I told her the situation. She's absolutely, free, willing and available to lend her expert advice. should that be required in Australia. This is something that's helping veterans all around the world. In Israel, for goodness sake, it's supplied by the government for the veterans for PTSD.
What was her name again?
Sue Sisley.
Oh, you know.
Yeah,
Sue
yes,
Sisley.
We've our organisation Prism has been working very, very closely with MAPS in the US, and of course Dr. Sisley is, as I understand it, doing her study through and with MAPS, and I think she'll be at the symposium in Tweed Heads. Is that right?
No, unfortunately, she couldn't make it this year because of her trial work. So her reporting period is just about here. So she has a lot on her plate at the moment. But we really are looking forward to hearing the results of that trial. That will be one of the biggest trials ever on PTSD. And even though I haven't heard the results, by all accounts, anything that she's given away so far is very favourable.
That's great.
And this is something that she feels completely passionate about. And like so many of us, she started out with this opinion of, what are these guys talking about when they're saying they're getting benefit from cannabis? They're just a bunch of stoners. But she's been humane enough to want to look beyond the anecdote and translate that to absolute research. And lo and behold, what her patients have been saying has been validated by the research. But here in this country, we don't even want to hear that there's research going on in other parts of the world,
That's right. And yet there's been cannabis research happening in Australian hospitals for many, many years, which has been absolutely under the radar, which I'm sure you're aware of, through, I think it's, is it GQ Pharmaceuticals from the UK?
GW Pharmaceuticals.
GW Pharmaceuticals. Yeah. So they've had clinical trials happening in numerous Australian hospitals for many, many years, haven't they?
They have supplied the New South Wales trials and I believe the Queensland trials now. But can I say one other thing about GW Pharmaceuticals? That product is products that they make, such as Epidiolex, which are being used in the paediatric epilepsy trials. They also produce Sativex for multiple sclerosis. Those products, work for some people, but not for everybody. So what actually has happened with the use of putting the deals that have been done at a government level with GW Pharmaceuticals has actually been very detrimental to a lot of Australian patients, because if you look at Epidiolex, for example, there are children that won't respond to Epidiolex, but will respond to other cannabis products. But because of the deals at high levels, then that those children are excluded from accessing anything other than Epidiolex. Now that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Is that because it's a plant extract and not the full range of compounds that you find in the plant? Do you think that's the reason why they're not responding?
Well, look, I think GW do have a lot of clinical trials under their belt, and to their credit, and that's a great thing. And the government, like I said, they want to hide behind the idea that you must have evidence and you must have trials. So Sativex is the only product that's registered as being available on the ARTG in Australia. So for them that's a safe option. But every other cannabis product is an unapproved medicine. So basically, the way Australia's chosen to regulate cannabis has really put all these products into a regulatory limbo. So they're approved, unapproved medicines. And that plays into the cost factor, because they're never ever going to be available on the PBS because they are unapproved.
Yeah, and for listeners who might not be aware, one of the key issues behind all of this is that cannabis can't be patented because it's a plant and it's in the public domain. So big pharmaceutical companies generally have not been interested in producing and marketing cannabis products because they can't exclusively market them and make money at them. They can't own the intellectual property. And so GW Pharmaceuticals have got around this by patenting a delivery system. And getting around it that way, and they've certainly, they've been pioneering in terms of big pharmaceutical companies pushing into the medical cannabis market, but it's been problematic, as you say.
Yeah, and also the cost of those products is very high. There's just so many problems in this space. That's why I say we need a political hero to try and sort this out. And I think really the push is going to come from the independents and the minor parties, people like Richard DiNatale, who really has recognised the problems. He actually, the way he sought to set this up in the beginning through the regulator of medicinal cannabis bill, which he announced back at our 2014 symposium, that recognised that all these potential problems could crop up, and hence the need to regulate cannabis independently, as separate through the TGA model, which we use for all other pharmaceutical preparations. But, and my feeling is that at this point in time, we need to go back to where we started. We need to throw out the system that we've got. We need to get back to the idea of an independent regulator and sort this mess out, because just as Richard DiNatale predicted back in 2014, we're going to have issues around access and around cost. So, we've had to sit back and watch all this play out and, be patient and, pray to God that we don't have a lot of patients that are suffering too much in the meantime. But, here we are, all these years down the track, we've got a system that's failing, and we've got no politician other than these minor parties and independents who are prepared to acknowledge that there's a problem.
And one of the ridiculous things is, of course, that Canada, which is a country that we often might compare ourselves to, have recently legalised the recreational use of cannabis. So here we are, caught behind all this ridiculous bureaucracy and people saying, at least at surface level, that they're worried about the risks and we need more research and that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, it's available recreationally in Canada.
Yeah, and look, another thing too that really, is like salt into the wound of patients and advocates is the fact that our health minister very quickly announced that Australian companies would be allowed to export to the rest of the world.
Yes.
So, on one hand they're saying that, it's too risky and we need more research, and we have these very narrow guidances for people that are eligible to meet that meet their very strict criteria. In the next breath, he's saying he wants Australia to be a global exporter for the rest of the world.
Yes, it doesn't quite add up, doesn't it?
It doesn't add up. It just adds up to somebody who's actually thinking about the hip pocket and not about the patients that are suffering. And someone who I think needs reminding that he's actually the health minister, and not in
not
charge
the wealth minister, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Lucy, we're going to have to finish up soon. There's so much to talk about here. Now, the conference, the symposium itself, as I've said, is on the 22nd, 23rd and 24th of March, coming up very soon, up in Tweed Heads, and it's produced by your organisation, unitedincompassion.com.au. You can go to the website for that, and I'm sure there are still some tickets available for those who are interested out there. And I guess without going into too much detail about the many amazing guests that are coming, people who want to get interested in this and perhaps attend 1 or 3 days or whatever on the menu, there they can go to your website, unitedincompassion.com.au. But just very quickly, in the last couple of minutes, we've got a bit of a rundown about some of the guests that you have that really stick out, because you've got an incredible guest list of very professional and well-known speakers. Can you give us a bit of a sketch of that, please?
Oh, yes. Look, I've got people coming from the US. So Olivia Newton-John's husband, John Easterling, who's a plant researcher,
yes,
dedicated his life to this sort of study, and now obviously helping Olivia to battle her cancer. Donald Abrams, a very renowned and senior oncologist from America, who made a quote, which I heard years ago, saying there's barely a cancer patient for whom I wouldn't recommend cannabis. That really stuck in my mind. Mark Ware from Canada, an expert on using cannabis as an opiate replacement, and that's something we need to hear about. And then Didi Mary from Israel, who studies cannabis for the treatment of cancer. And that's, I met him years ago in Israel. He was a skeptic, and now he's so excited about what he's able to prove and how cannabis can actually cure cancer. So pretty amazing stuff. And just finally, I'd just like to say to patients, if there are patients out there who want to come along and learn and who can't afford a ticket, please contact us through the website. We'd love to help you get there.
Fantastic.
I think that's really important, that we give a voice to patients.
Thanks, Lucy. We'll both be there, so we look forward to seeing you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Okay, lovely.
Lucy Haslam.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Yes, we'll talk again too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're tuned to FutureSense with Nyck Jeanes and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
You are with Bay FM. It's 10:08 here on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and myself, Nyck Jeanes, through till 11 o'clock. And we're going to take a little bit of a look, just a sketchy look, or not a sketchy look, a sketch look at the history of cannabis and with regards to social change, because it's got a checkered history, especially in the last century or so.
It does, a long and complex history too. It was first regulated in the early 1900s in the US, and eventually they introduced what was called the Marijuana Tax Act, which I'm not sure the details of, but being a tax act, obviously was driven partially, at least, by the collection of revenue around the use of marijuana in the US, and it's long had associations with race issues in the USA.
Oh, okay.
As well, of course, and was closely associated with Mexico, and was called the dreaded Mexican loco weed, and also with African Americans as well, I'm sure. And so the whole issue of cannabis use has been tied up with race, and I guess everybody, of course, has heard of the war on drugs, and President Richard Nixon played a key role in introducing legislation in 1970, which scheduled cannabis under the most poisonous, class of drugs, Schedule 1 in the USA, alongside with a whole lot of other, arguably dangerous drugs like heroin and those sorts of things. And it wasn't a scientific process at all, and this is part of the unravelling which is taking place at the moment, is that there's been this long-term social attitude towards scheduled drugs, and in Australia our most serious schedule is 9, which equates to Schedule 1 in the USA, and of course cannabis was on Schedule 9 here,
along with heroin and the like.
That's right, and also MDMA, and for people like Lucy and the medical cannabis movement, and also the organisation I'm associated with, PRISM, and the psychedelic movement, who are trying to have the usefulness of these drugs recognised, and also the fact that they are actually scientifically proven to be much less harmful than things like alcohol and tobacco. It's hard to get over this entrenched public attitude, which has been fed by government propaganda for many, many years, and a lot of money was poured into supporting those legislative changes, which were politically driven and not scientifically driven, and a lot of money was also poured into scientific research. And as Lucy was saying, when the government or institutions have an agenda to find a particular outcome about a substance, they'll pour money into research, and they'll say, to scientists, we'll pay you to research this, to look at the dangers of drug X. And of course, when you are relying on your funding from an organisation, and you can't do your research without the funding, there's a terrible amount of pressure there for you to toe the line and follow whatever the guidelines of the funding say. And so we've got a lot of research studies that have been done out there which were specifically funded to find problems. And the way that those played out often was that they would be research done on animals, rats and mice, and they would be given extraordinarily high amounts of a particular drug, like ridiculous amounts, compared to the amount that a human might ingest. And of course,
that's science, isn't it? That's good science, right?
But it's like, to give an analogy, it's like saying, okay, we want to fund some research into salt, so we'll pay you, Nyck Jeanes, a salt scientist, to do this research for us, and we're going to give you $100,000 for the research, but you have to look at how dangerous salt is. And so you end up replacing the water container with salt, and forcing it down the mouths of rats and mice, and they all die. And what relationship does that have to the fact that salt is actually quite useful and relatively harmless when you sprinkle a tiny amount on your food at dinner time? It's just a ridiculous situation. And the same thing has happened with drugs like MDMA and also cannabis. I mean, cannabis is more problematic in that sense because it's very, very hard to kill something with cannabis. In fact, I'm not sure it's ever been done.
And there is, as most of you would know, a history of medical cannabis going back to ancient times. Ancient physicians in many parts of the world mixed cannabis into medicines to treat pain and other ailments. It's been known for a very long time, of course, amongst many other amazing uses of this particularly extraordinary plant. And has, how many compounds? Because the two classes of compounds, there's hundreds of compounds in. It's a very extremely complex plant, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not my field. I'm not an expert on cannabis, but if I remember correctly, I think there are over 300 different compounds in the plant, which is extraordinary, and it explains why it is so useful. It has so many uses because there are so many different compounds in there. Exactly. And the other thing that some people might not know, of course, is that we actually have cannabinoids in our body naturally, which are called endocannabinoids, endo meaning that they're produced internally. And so we have naturally occurring cannabis receptors that are just sitting there waiting to accept a cannabinoid. And this is why, of course, it can be such a useful substance for humans to use also.
Yeah, and our good friend Ross Hill, who's been a guest on this show a couple of times, sent us a thing. I haven't had a good look at the whole piece. It's a study from the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs comparing mental health across distinct groups of users of psychedelics, MDMA, psychostimulants and cannabis. And I gather that the result has come out that users of these particular substances have no less baseline mental health issues than anybody else. They're not less mentally healthy, let's put it that way, whereas apparently those users of legal substances such as alcohol in certain demographics tend to have mental health problems already, and probably in some ways, arguably, in my opinion, aggravated by the excessive use of alcohol and other stimulants. And of course, we mentioned opiates there with Lucy Haslam and the replacement of medicinal cannabis over opiates and
prescription opiates,
which we have a serious problem with in this country and certainly in America. Even Trump has mentioned about the opiate epidemic in the US.
If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure that more people die from misuse of prescription drugs in Australia than illicit drugs. The numbers are extraordinarily high with prescription drugs, and prescription opiates are a big issue. And the bottom line is that you really can't argue with the science. I mean, you just look at the facts of how many people are harmed from alcohol use in Australia. For example, on average, 15 people die every day in Australia from alcohol-related illnesses and issues. How many people die every day from marijuana in Australia? None, probably.
And as Lucy Haslam also indicated, the politicians, other than the Greens and the minor parties, are suspiciously quiet over this without actually touting directly alcohol or other substances. They're basically, by their silence, sort of advocating for the status quo, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of the alcohol industry, for example, it must be a tremendous risk to their bottom line, their income, their profits, to have another drug, entering into their marketplace. I mean, I guess they see it as a slippery slope. And while the introduction of medical use for cannabis in Australia is a very controlled and limited issue, it's the thin end of the wedge, I guess, from the point of view of these lobby groups. That if it does become socially acceptable as a medicine, then the next step, logically, and looking historically at places like Canada in the USA, is eventually accepting its recreational use, because it is a very harmless drug relative to things like cannabis and tobacco. And so that is going to cost some people a lot of money in the long run. And so I guess for them, strategically, it makes sense for them to throw money at trying to resist change around this. And I'm sure that's what they're doing. And not only the drinks lobby, of course, but the pharmaceutical industry as well. Because if people are using medical cannabis instead of other drugs, then, again, it's going to eat into their profits, their market slice.
Indeed. You're tuned to FutureSense. That's Steve McDonald and myself, Nyck Jeanes, here on Bay FM. Of course, through till 11 o'clock, Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond is up. Then let's take a little break here. And I should mention just before that we played a sponsorship announcement there from Ben Franklin of the Nationals. Of course, we play anybody who who pays equally on in terms of sponsorship for political announcements. There's no favour given there, but it's important though because we are offering a forum on the 18th, Monday the 18th, that's next Monday from tonight, down here in the community centre, with all of the candidates for the New South Wales state seat of Ballina, currently held by the Greens' Tamara Smith. There are 4 other candidates along with Ben Franklin now coming because our good friend and also broadcaster here, 6 to 8 on Wednesday night, 4 to 6 pardon, on Wednesday evenings is James Wright. He's standing for Keep, and also as a candidate from, I'm just reading here from something I haven't read before, sorry about that, for Keep Sydney Out, the 6th candidate, Lisa McDermott for Sustainable Australia. Yeah, won't be there, but there are now actually 6 candidates, so that's the update for Ballina Meet the Candidates. And you can email questions on medicinal cannabis, for example, or anything else to ballinameetthecandidates@gmail.com here on Bay FM.
You're resonating right now on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes.
10:29 on FutureSense here on 999, and a couple of tracks there. Some interesting indigenous music, a track called Ngura, Rain Song from Kadajala Kiradara. And after that, of course, the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Snow. And the Chili Peppers have been in the news just now because they've been in Australia. And they have Flea, who I didn't realise, Flea, the bassist from the Chili Peppers, actually was born in Melbourne. I did not know that, but he's come out on stage and had a bit of a go at the New South Wales Berejiklian government over their pill testing position. And yes, as he says, they're trying to pass a law so it's impossible to put on a concert, is what he says is happening there. Make it hard for people to go out and see live music, ? This is the stupidest effing thing I have ever heard of in my whole life, and just goes to this incredible position of with regards to these kind of substances and the obvious results that are occurring across the board with regards to social cohesion and disruption in society, and not actually listening to the people and not actually looking at the evidence of things. But there you go.
Yeah, we've got an election coming up, haven't we?
We have. We have a couple of elections coming up. 23rd of March, of course, the state election. And it's going to be a tight one, possibly. Looks like the daily Labor opposition is positioned to possibly take government, and it's going to depend on a lot of things. And also, of course, the vote for the minor parties, in particular the Greens, how that's going to fall out. Yeah,
exactly. And we were talking earlier on the show today to Lucy Haslam, and medical cannabis issues were the centre of the conversation. Of course, she's organising another symposium and has organised a number of symposiums since 2014 on the issue of medical cannabis, trying to promote its acceptance as a legal medicine in Australia. And cannabis, it's a really interesting drug in terms of social change. You know, if we look back to the last big wave of changing values that came through in the 60s and 70s, which was an early wave of what we're revisiting now, but in a more widespread and a stronger way, the shift from the modern scientific industrial, very rational, materialistic worldview to a much more humanistic, community-oriented way of seeing the world and way of valuing things. Cannabis has been central to that in many, many ways. You know, if you read stories about the hippie movement, the flower power, and Summer of Love, and all that kind of stuff in the 60s, you can't read too much without somebody mentioning cannabis. And we were just talking in the break about the different terms that can be used for it, cannabis or
this is very
marijuana, which of course is a Spanish word, and I guess the use of that and the uptake of that term instead of cannabis is tied to politics and social attitudes in America.
It was in like the 1930s or so that change from the word cannabis, which is a more correct botanical term for the plant species, to the word marijuana, as you said, which is a Spanish word.
Yeah, I'm looking at the website here of NPR, National Public Radio in the US.
Excellent.
And they ran a story a while back on cannabis, and they're quoting a few books and historical facts here. And in relation to this issue, they said suddenly the drug had a whole new identity, and they quote a New York Times headline from 1925 saying, Mexican crazed by marijuana runs amok with butcher knife. And it's interesting actually, because it's tempting to think that the US kind of twisted the language, but he said that the rise of the use of the term marijuana instead of cannabis actually started in Mexico and was tied to a lot of social fear that emerged in Mexico around that time and prior to that.
And again now, how curious, not particularly about marijuana, but certainly partly about supposedly drug trafficking as one aspect and the danger of these criminals and
it is interesting.
Rapists crossing the border and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, any time when there's a lot of change happening, people tend to increase their drug use, and the underlying sort of psychology of that is that when we go through change, in order to be open to and accept the change and enact it in our own world, we have to be able to see different perspectives. And one of the most effective ways of seeing the world differently is to alter our consciousness. And this is why we tend to drink alcohol or smoke marijuana or do whatever it is that you might do, when we feel under a bit of tension, pressure, stress, and there's a lot of change happening around us.
I wondered in that particular era in the US, which is of course the era of the 20s, the era of prohibition of alcohol, whether or not that facilitated in some sense a rise in the use of marijuana, cannabis, at which point of course prohibition was broken because people wanted to drink, and that didn't last very long. But perhaps that was also the moment when they realised, there's not going to be as much financial money in cannabis, and we need to get the alcohol back on the road. Let's make marijuana a bad thing, an evil thing.
It's an interesting question. I mean, what we can say for sure is that prohibition of alcohol didn't work, and in fact it increased the harm, because when people couldn't buy properly produced alcohol in the shops, they started brewing their own in the back shed, and of course often that process went wrong, and they would occasionally poison themselves and sometimes die from drinking their homemade moonshine, as it was called. And the same thing has happened with prohibition of drugs in the present day. Is it has actually created more harms than it addressed constructively. And by making it illegal, in that it can't be produced legally and it can't be regulated, you can't go to a shop and buy one of these psychoactive drugs and get a book or a little booklet of instructions saying don't operate heavy machinery and that kind of thing. It's left to people who to do it illegally, and of course they're automatically criminals when they do that, and they're often people who can be motivated by many, many different things. Some of them are motivated by pure goodness and wanting to help people, but others are motivated by money, don't really care what it is that they put out there in the market, and of course occasionally it kills people. And
that also goes back to the value systems, doesn't it, that approach to things like this, and whether people are facilitating the use of one way or the other for money or for the benefit of people, for freedom and for compassion, for empathy, especially when it comes to medicinal cannabis.
Yeah, that's right. And so, what we're motivated by is shaped by our values, and our values change as we develop through the various layers of consciousness. And at the earlier layers, which are less complex, we can be very egocentric and just thinking about what we want, and literally we don't have the capacity to be aware of and sense and think about the impact that we're having on other people. We're just focused on what we want to get. But it's amazing to look at how these values change as the dominant value system shifts from one thing to another thing, one layer to another layer in society, and how radically attitudes towards certain things, including attitudes toward cannabis, can change. I've got a couple of little examples here which I'd like to read off
this
NPR website.
I love the NPR website.
The first one is an excerpt from the Western Journal of Medicine and Surgery from May 1843. And
Wild West.
The title of the article is The Indian Hemp. And I'm quoting now: "The resin of the cannabis indica is in general use as an intoxicating agent from the furthermost confines of India to Algiers. If this resin be swallowed, almost invariably the inebriation is of the most cheerful kind, causing the person to sing and dance, to eat food with great relish, and to seek aphrodisiac enjoyment. The intoxication lasts about 3 hours, when sleep supervenes. It is not followed by nausea or sickness, nor by any symptoms except slight giddiness worth recording. So there you go. That was from an official medicine journal, 1843.
That sounds actually quite scientific. Very well done.
It does, actually.
Observation, science.
Yeah, and they say here most of the pre-1900 press references to cannabis relate either to its medical usage or its role as an industrial textile.
Yeah.
And of course, famously, many people may have heard that the first Ford motor car, its bodywork was made out of hemp.
That's right. Yeah. Not to mention before that, most of the sails and most of the sailing ships and all the rope.
The rope,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I've got another excerpt here, which is from a news article from the Chicago Tribune in 1874. And it's just a great example of how the public attitudes shifted in that time since
30-odd years.
30-odd years or so. Here we go, and I'm quoting now. Not long ago, a man who had smoken a marijuana cigarette attacked and killed a policeman and badly wounded 3 others. 6 policemen were needed to disarm him and march him to the police station, where he had to be put into a straitjacket. Such occurrences are frequent. People who smoke marijuana finally lose their mind and never recover it, but their brains dry up and they die, most of times suddenly. There you go.
6 policemen, boy, it must be a bit like Popeye's spinach, this particular strain of marijuana.
I think
six
so.
policemen to restrain the man.
Yeah. So isn't it amazing how opinions can shift, and you've got to ask yourself, what was driving the change in attitudes that led to that very, very different perspective on cannabis use.
Indeed.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM.
Bit of Angus and Julia Stone there, and a track called Nothing Else here on Bay FM. The last 15 minutes of FutureSense, and Sean is up next with pregnancy, birth and beyond. And we've been talking, as it turns out, mostly today about cannabis, medicinal cannabis, but also a bit of the history of cannabis, also known, of course, as marijuana. And fascinating how it fits into the cultural changes as we see them pass by, and we should factor that in terms of how we approach it right now. Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking, I'd quoted a couple of articles just before that music break, talking about cannabis, and one article from a medical journal from the 1840s, and then another article from a paper in Chicago in 1870 with 2 radically different attitudes towards cannabis. One pro and one anti. And one of the things to keep in mind is often these reports, particularly media reports about people taking a drug, are simply an assumption based on someone's rough idea or hearsay about what's been taken, and rarely is there actually any scientific evidence that somebody took a substance and no information about whether it was pure or mixed with 13 other substances or whatever. And so when we see these news articles, and it still happens right to the present day, and most commonly around music festivals, which are a huge issue here in New South Wales with an election coming up, of course, and the Berejiklian government's seemingly hardline and ignorant attitude towards opening up to pill testing. Often when there is an injury or a death at a music festival from a drug, the media will come out and say this person died from taking this, without any evidence whatsoever. There's somebody heard or somebody estimated or somebody thought that they took that, but there's actually no scientific evidence. And even if the person thought they were taking something, there's no evidence that the person was correct in knowing what they took, because they bought it illegally and they had no label and no guarantee of what it was.
It's very interesting, because I've never seen a report post a death or serious injury with what has been claimed to be ecstasy, for example. Never seen a report on actually what was contained in the particular thing they've taken. I'm sure they do a test after someone dies. So
sometimes the police will issue a report after the fact, after testing, and I'm sure sometimes that's not necessarily communicated. Well, I know for sure. Sometimes they're not communicated to the public, those things. Sometimes I think they're starting to open up on that, but in the past they've actually restricted that information. But cannabis and social change. I know we've only got a few minutes left, but I'd really love just to talk briefly about music and cannabis.
Absolutely.
Which is something that Nyck and I have read a bit about, both being musicians. And of course, cannabis was famously associated with jazz musicians early
stuff,
last
jazz,
century.
All those strange notes.
And I'm just randomly pulling quotes and things off the internet here, but there's an article about jazz and cannabis, and it says in talking about cannabis and music, the wannabe Batman, this was, I think, a wannabe jazz musician. As far as marijuana and jazz musicians were concerned, he said the interesting thing was it lengthens the sense of time, and therefore they could get more grace beats into their music than they could if they simply followed the written copy. In other words, if you're a musician, you're going to play the thing the way it's printed on a sheet if you're not on marijuana or cannabis. But if you're using marijuana, this says here, you're going to work in about twice as much music between the first note and the second note, and that's what made jazz musicians, the idea that they could jazz things up, liven them up.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, exactly, and so it's had, of course, a radical impact on the development of music and the human relationship with music over the years, and many, most psychoactive things, apart from changing our perspective on the world generally, they'll specifically impact our relationship with time. And often, it's about slowing time down and extending it, which gives us very different perspectives on
basically
things.
Activating more of the right brain, essentially, which is arguably something we should be doing much more of over the practical, logical, mathematical aspect of the left brain.
Yeah, that's right. And I know when Nixon was famously enacting his crackdown on drugs around the 1970 time period, I know that there was specific mention made to Afro-American musicians and the use of marijuana, particularly jazz musicians.
Yes.
And so you can see how the race issues were brought into it there. And also, I guess, the fact that jazz was a radical departure from conventional music at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely, in the 20s, for sure.
And so, you've got to factor in also this resistance to change and being afraid of something new and something that sounds a bit weird, something that we're not used to hearing. It's all very, very complex, but very interesting.
Yeah. And of course, the Nixon era, I just recently saw, I can't remember the name of it, a documentary on John Lennon at that time, who moved to New York, of course, around that time, the 70s, at the Nixon era. And of course, it was Vietnam, and it was the end of the summer of love, or that era, that period. Timothy Leary, the other substances which were being under research in Harvard and other major colleges, universities around America under Timothy Leary, and people like Richard Alpert, Ramdas, and the like, and all of that was closed down by the Nixon administration because of its association with the revolutionary movement against the Vietnam War, and John Lennon was completely caught up in that as well, and the Malcolm X and many other were seen to be radicals, and often, of course, as you're saying, Black Americans, African Americans. And so there was a whole project clearly that went on at that time to stifle, to suppress, and stymie any openness in culture of
That's
creativity
right.
and a different sort of political movement of the times.
And the Vietnam War was a major political issue, and Nixon was pushing it, and the last thing he wanted was opposition to that, and he saw the use of cannabis and also in particular LSD by these hippies. And jazz musicians, obviously, as a key influence, on their perspective of the world and their anti-drug attitudes. And of course, that was, I think, a big part of the motivation for him to crack down on it. Just while we're on musicians, I'm just reading an article here about Louis Armstrong, who most people would have heard of.
Oh, what a wonderful world.
A famous brass player, and he first tried cannabis in the 1920s and used it throughout his career, including before performances and recordings. He referred to cannabis affectionately as the gauge, a common parlance of the time.
The gauge.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Thanks for a couple of your texts here. One text here, wonderful chat. Happy to hear about the progress being made in the cannabis field by such wonderful people. Education is definitely the key, and communication with the right language is essential. We must change our values and become open to new medicines moving into the future. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, thank you. Another text too on a different topic, and we have talked about this a number of times, but not a whole thing, because we're looking into this as part of everything here and there. Someone has written also, Australia needs urgent warning of the imminent 5G rollout. Can that be a future program? Yeah, we have mentioned that before, and perhaps we'll come back to it again.
Yeah, it's a very tricky issue.
Very tricky issue.
Because it's very hard to get reliable scientific information about the radiation uses around 5G, and from my fairly shallow reading of it, it looks like commercialism is driving the rollout, and it's basically the same issue that we're encountering with medical cannabis, is that there are commercial lobby groups that stand to lose money if these things don't happen, and so they don't want research being done, and if there is research there, they don't want it being communicated, and so that makes it problematic for us to have a discussion about it. It's quite possible that there are serious risks and issues around 5G, and we may not know, unfortunately, until it gets rolled out in places and those problems start showing up and we get reliable reports about it.
Indeed. We've also been talking a little bit, and I may have him on my Friday show, or possibly on Monday show, is former head of the Federal Police, Mick Palmer, pardon me, because he's got an interesting quote when we're talking about racial or certainly socioeconomic profiles of people. What was that about?
I tried to track it down, but I couldn't actually find it. But if my memory serves me correctly, he's been very outspoken about drug law reform for many years, and he's part of the Australia 21 think tank, along with Dr. Alex Wodak and a bunch of other folks. And if my memory serves me correctly, I remember him saying that, if he was policing a town, he would much rather that the people had been taking MDMA than alcohol, because it would be a much easier process to keep them in line on a Saturday night. Something along those lines.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's about all we've got time for. It's 10:55 coming up. As I said, pregnancy, birth and beyond very shortly. We'll, I've got a track going already. Let's pull that back a bit. Been bustling and rustling over here this morning.
I just found a really interesting little anecdote here, which I can squeeze in on this article where I was reading about Louis Armstrong cannabis. This may not be true, but it says that the most often told fable from Armstrong's relationship with Tricky Dicky Richard Nixon, who was then the vice president, was 1953. After Armstrong flew out of Japan, he encountered Vice President Nixon at the airport.
Oh, really?
Nixon was surprised to see the trumpeter and said, "Satchmo, what are you doing here?" And Armstrong explained that he'd just finished a Goodwill Ambassador's tour of Asia and was now headed toward customs. And Nixon scoffed and grabbed Satchmo's suitcases, saying, "Ambassadors don't have to go through customs." And the jazz legend's suitcase, filled with nearly 3 pounds of cannabis, was carried by Vice President Richard Nixon through the airport, bypassing customs. And Nixon unknowingly smuggled cannabis into the United States. I wonder if that's true. I mean, it's a good story.
That's a good story.
It ought to be true if it's not.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. We'll be back next week, Monday morning, 9 to 11.
Thanks, Nick.
On FutureSense. And stay tuned to Bay FM through the day. And as I said before, check in with the Meet the Candidates. If politics is your thing and you want to get even more activated, even more engaged with, then tune in and be there at the Meet the Candidates Forum downstairs here in the Byron Community Theatre next Monday on the 18th. And 5 candidates out of the 6 who are standing for the seat of Ballina in the New South Wales state elections will be there, and it'll be hosted by the wonderful Angela Caterns, who's become a good friend of Bay FM post her wonderful time at Triple J and Radio National. So tune into that, and I'll be with you also on Friday from 9 to 11 on North Coast Positive. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to FutureSense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. FutureSense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.